processor in the United States, or you have a waiver. There's a couple kinds of waivers. There's a class waiver, and then there's a contract-specific waiver that says, look, for this contract, we're going to waive this fourth bullet, this fourth element. Or there's also a class waiver that says, look, generally, there's not small businesses that provide this. That's things often like airline travel, other things. I can't think of many off the top of my head, but other things that just small businesses don't typically do. So it's okay to say, look, we do have to provide something from a large business here. We can't do this small business situated in the US. But keep in mind, that's the only one of the 4 factors that can be waived. So all of those other ones would need to be met. Typically, you're looking at limitation on subcontracting or non-manufacturer rule, or you are the manufacturer. But for purposes of today as the middleman, you're definitely going to be looking at those other 2 generally. So I'll kind of do that as big picture for now. I briefly mentioned ostensible subcontractor rule, which is definitely a rule that is not a limitation on subcontracting rule per se. It is actually an affiliation rule. So what that does is if you were to have a small business prime get this award, but the small business prime starts just handing out massive amounts of the important parts of the contracts, the primary and vital parts of the contract to a large sub. And it starts kind of being unduly reliant on that sub. So it could not perform. If this sub quit, they'd be in trouble, big trouble. So that's kind of the other part there you have to keep in mind. So while that is an affiliation rule, it's contract specific affiliation. So if you are deemed by SBA to have an ostensible subcontractor, you don't have to panic that that's going to be forever and ever your affiliate. It's your affiliate for the contract at hand. So if you both add your sizes together and you still don't meet that size standard, then you can lose an award, lose a contract, and there can actually be other consequences. Some of the rule updates talk about those as well. But just recently, we've had a really good rule update that's going to clarify things a bit in our many times defending against the ostensible subcontractor allegations that our clients have gotten. We've said, look, we're complying with the limitation on subcontracting. So shouldn't that be a defense here? I mean, if we're only contracting out 50%, I would say there's at least some argument there that that's not probably going to be all of the primary and vital work that you need to do. So the good news is SBA has recently issued some rules that do make that a defense. And one of the exceptions is construction contracts, because you can't do a construction contract and go ahead and meet that limitation on subcontracting, which actually only requires you to do 15% of the work. But that one specifically talks about the type of work that the SBA believes is primary and vital. Right. And it's supervising, managing, controlling subcontractors. So that is one exception in this new rule that's coming out. It does say, even if you meet the limitation on subcontracting for that one, you could still potentially violate the primary and vital. And again, I think that's kind of 2-pronged. 1, because that's such a small percentage, you only have to do 15. And 2, because we know what that primary and vital work is. And so we want to make sure that's not going out. Whereas for services contracts, generally, there's a whole analysis you have to do to figure out what that primary and vital work is. So that's big picture on those 3 kind of really big topics we could do whole webinars on, and then turn it back to Carol and we can go into more details on some of those aspects.
Yeah, that was great. Recap on all of those things. I don't want to go to Michael here, but I want to just we'll say we're going to come back to a few of these things. I want to talk about a little bit of the specifics. But Michael, what do you see when it comes to folks that are coming into the marketplace? I mean, either with some of the regulations or even maybe other issues that might crop up that might present issues and challenges to them being able to get the contracts.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I see that's a really big problem, and I don't really know where this originated, but and maybe it started somewhere around COVID, maybe a little bit before, but there's been a lot of a surge of people that kind of do what you and I do, that only want to talk about the middleman. And excuse me, the focus has been selling a course or something to people who are brand new to government contracting. I would say it's the people that almost can't spell government contract. Like, you're so brand new that you don't know what you don't know. And there's a lot of these people out there, in my opinion, this is just Mike's opinion, kind of preying on these people that are brand new, trying to get into the market and saying, go buy my course. I'll show you how to be a middleman. You don't need a product. You don't need a service. You don't need a staff. You can do this from your home. You don't need a credit line. It's so easy to sell to the government. The government is, trying to sell stuff to minority-owned companies, status companies, and they're in such a need that this is going to be a home run for you. If you just go buy my course, that's $900, $1,500, whatever dollars, I'm going to teach you how to make millions of dollars in your underwear right from your bedroom with just a laptop and a cell phone. I'm not exaggerating when I throw that out there as the pitch. I mean, that is the pitch I'm seeing. And there's dozens that I know of. And every week I hear of more of these people that I've never heard of before. I'm like, I've never heard of this person. And they're selling the course on this because somebody will reach out. Hey, do you know Bob Smith over in whatever? I'm like, never heard of him. Show me the website. And I'm like, oh, it's another middleman strategy trying to do this. And so the middleman strategy does work. I'll say that with a lot of caveats, right? And Nicole talked about a bunch of the rules and regulations and those kind of things, which they don't really talk about in the advertising or marketing of these middleman programs that are out there. You'll learn it the hard way once you get in, but it's not in the marketing, because if they told you, hey, there's all these rules you got to comply with, you probably wouldn't drop $1,500 on their course, right? So that's the first thing that I really want people to understand, is to be extremely wary of this as a core business model that you're being pitched. That's the first thing, because it's not a core business model. Right. It's just not. It may get some people into the market, but again, it's one of those things where when people approach me, I'm like, well, it depends.
Yeah.
And the second thing that I see for a lot of people is they're like, well, what should I sell? And they're starting to look at things and I'm like, well, what do you know? Because if you've never been a business owner and you've never done business with the government, you have two uphill battles out of the gate: how to be a business owner, how to sell to the government. You're going to throw a third one in of trying to learn a product that you've never heard of. Like, I don't know anything about, engines and engine parts and all that, but I heard the government buys a lot of that, so I want to sell that. Like, do you have a background in it? Nope. Okay, well, this is going to be difficult for you, right? So I always, when somebody comes to me, I just had a guy the other day. He was like, man, I really want to do this. We're currently, they have an arborist business, so they do a lot of tree work and things like that. He's like, but I want to sell engine parts. Like, why? Why are you choosing that? And he was one of the few people that actually had a background. He was like, when I've been coming up over the years, I know ins and outs of all these stuff. I know the manufacturers. I know those kind of things. I'm like, okay, well, then you can go down that route. But if you told me something you don't know, then I'm going to be like, man, you got 3 strikes against you. This is going to be really difficult. So when you're coming into this market and the middleman is your strategy, I always tell people, go with a product you understand or a service you understand. If you're a general contractor today, like Nicole was talking about on the contracting side, that's a strategy where you can be somewhat the middleman, right? But you need to do things that you understand, because again, it's an uphill battle for people who are brand new and don't know any of that type of stuff. If you've been in the market and you're more of a well-established business and you're trying to add this to your business, you're most likely going to do it as a VAR, a value-added reseller. And the thing I always say is you got to bring the V to this game, because a lot of people don't bring the value add. Yeah. They just want to say, I just want to sell the product. I just want to sell what value are you adding? Because if you're not adding value, then the challenge is going to be, well, how many people sell Salesforce licenses or SAP licenses or, Microsoft licenses? Well, there's thousands, maybe tens of thousands. So what's the value you provide, why they would buy from you, and figuring that type of stuff out. So it's not as clear cut and dry as a lot of these courses out there make it out to be. And you've got to think through this a little bit more. And then you've got to deal with, regulations, restrictions, all those kind of things. So that's my cautionary tale out of the gate here, is to just be wary of the model and understand it's not a core business model for most folks. It's just not, because the other downside, even if you are a VAR, the government wants a big discount. So guess what? Even if you're selling $100,000 worth of product, you might make 6 or 8%. Then you've got credit card fees if you have credit card fees. So can you live on $6,000? Probably not. So how many of those contracts do you have to win to actually make a living? A lot of them. Even if you're doing $1 million in sales, it's a decent income, but it's $1 million in sales. Right. And so that may be 10, 12, 15 contracts for you to win. So just thinking through those types of things is what I always caution people when they're talking middleman, profitability, knowing the product or service you're trying to sell. Those are just some of probably my opening, thoughts around it. So,
man, thank you. You've hit a lot of nails right on the head, and I'll share a story that relates exactly to what you were saying, Michael. And not a lot of people know this, but before we launched Scavology, I used to like to play the guinea pig, and I used to look at these things that were, people were saying out there about do this, do that. And we actually, for about a year, we were kind of doing some construction things, and we were, the majority of what we were selling, we were doing some construction supply sales, and having kind of knowing all of these rules and trying to bake them into everything, it made it challenging from a number of aspects. One aspect was one of the things that Nicole brought up earlier with this notion of you having to take possession of the material with your personnel, property, ownership, etc. Right? So then I started saying, well, a lot of resellers are just really kind of drop shipping from the manufacturer to the end user. And how do we actually get this done, legally? I mean, and can we say, hey, if we basically take possession virtually by putting insurance when it leaves the destination, and we kind of own it in transit and it gets to the other side, does that comply with the non-manufacturer's rule and all of that stuff? By the way, for those of you guys who are resellers, if you don't have the manufacturer NAICS codes built into your profiles, you're going to want to have those, even if you're not the manufacturers, because that's kind of the essence of the non-manufacturer's rule in a weird way. And mostly the government will buy even from the resellers through the manufacturer's NAICS codes. So that's one little tip. But let me kind of continue my story, and I'll make it as quickly as shortly as possible. But before I do that, Mike, one thing that you said that's really rings true is you see all these pop up gurus who's like, hey, just do this, and you make millions of dollars like I did. When I see that, there's a couple of things that I think about. Number one, I know that because every contractor's journey is a little bit differently, whatever that person was selling might be different than what you sell. And you need to understand the rules and regulations around what you sell, not necessarily around what somebody else sells. I'll also say this, even if they did make, a couple $1 million or $1 million in sales selling to the government for a short period of time, where are they now? Are they still selling to the government? Did they do it right? I mean, if you look at the story of War Dogs, which I know a lot of people have seen the movie, I recommend actually listening to the audiobook if you ever want to really hear something very intriguing. But you could get a person like that come out and be like, hey, I sold hundreds of millions of dollars to the government. Let me tell you how I did it. Doesn't mean that they did it right, And so, but as we did this for a year, we made about 300,000 in sales. But, what I realized is kind of like the back and forth. And you also, not only that, but you have to make sure that you're flowing down the appropriate regulations to your contractors and your suppliers, right? Both in an official RFQ, so they can give you the right pricing. If it says that you've got to get your product over, if it's coming from overseas on a US flagged vessel, that needs to be carried down to the subs that ultimately is going to be part of the whole equation, so you can meet your compliance and the whole 9 yards. But what you said rings very true with, hey, at the end of the day, if you make 5 or 6%, yeah, I mean, on $1 million of sales, but what a lot of folks don't account for is that 5 or 6% is not profit. You got to take out also all the time you spent that entire year talking with suppliers, doing the work, building the RFQs back and forth, and all of your time invested. So you need to take that part out. And then what are you left over with? And so that's one of the other issues. Is if you're selling kind of like a commodity type of item, like everybody else is selling, you know, you're probably going to be squeezed and pinched, you know, if you're not selling like massively, like millions and millions of dollars every year. So, you know, those are the few things that I had run into. And I was like, you know, this is not really worth it to do all of this work to basically actually sell for this percentage. And in fact, one of the distributors that we were working with, we ultimately said, look, you know, why don't we just become like kind of like a manufacturer's rep for you, which a manufacturer's rep is like, okay, I'm not leveraging my certification to make the sale, but I've got knowledge and I'll just help you guys get the sales. Because at the end of the day, you know, you're basically working for a commission anyway out of it,
Right.
you know? And so I'd rather actually have, if it's not set aside or, you know, for a particular entity, I can use my knowledge to help a company get sales and make a little commission off of that, rather than have to do all of the work, you know, because now they're accountable. They've got to deal with the government at the prime contract level. And so that's a strategy that I've talked to some folks about, is that maybe you consider setting up something where, yes, if it does go set aside, you can do that as a set aside and you understand the rules. By the way, I would encourage everybody, if you don't have a good GovCon attorney and you want to play this game, you know, reach out to Nicole and have a conversation to understand, like, what is it you actually sell, so they can help you really build a compliance plan around those sales. And that's super important.
Yeah.
So
you brought up a couple of really good ones there, Carol. You know, the drop shipping one is a pet peeve of mine for these folks, because they think they could just drop ship. I have a quick story on that one. I had a client who sold plumbing parts through a third party. The government ordered like $60,000 worth of plumbing parts. And what it was really about $60,000 $1 parts. And so, and they drop shipped it to the customer, and then the customer went dark, and they're like, why haven't they accepted the shipment? What's going on?
I know where this is going.
Yeah, we're 30, 60, 90 days. Yeah, you probably heard this. We're 90 days out, can't get paid. And finally, somebody gets a hold of the customer and they're like, can we come down there? Because we see it's in your warehouse, and like, it's not in the warehouse. They show up. Sure enough, it's in the warehouse. It's in a far back corner because they wouldn't check it in because it wasn't labeled properly.
Mm-hmm.
They were supposed to have it because they didn't read the directions. Now, this is a directions problem, but because they had it drop shipped, they were just like, oh, I'm drop shipping it from there to there.
Right.
And they were supposed to have every single part, all 60,000, in its own bag with its own label. And so the government was basically, you can label it. We can send it back to your place. So you can pay for shipping. You can label it at your place.
Oh, man.
Or you can pay us to do it. And they had to come out of their pocket. So they lost all their profit plus money out of their pocket, because they're like, to pay to ship it to our office, 60,000 plumbing. Like, we can't afford that, right? So they didn't understand what was involved, and the manufacturer was not going to label it that way and drop ship it for them. So they had that problem. The other problem I find with, like, when you're doing stuff like this is, it's one thing when you have a really good, and this is the flip side, the positive side. It's one thing when you have a really good relationship with a manufacturer.
Yeah.
But the challenge I see for a lot of new middleman people, and this is the thing to be aware of, is they'll see an RFP and it's for something that they've never sold before. And they're like, oh, well, I'll just go get a relationship with a manufacturer. You're probably not going to get that squared away in time. You're probably not going to get financing from them. You're probably not going to really understand the products. You're not going to understand their process. There's so many things to just go, hey, I'm just going to start selling plumbing products on Monday. Like, there's a lot of work that goes into that, because a challenge another client of ours had was the government came to them and they bought about $20,000 in power strips, which seems on the surface like a really simple transaction, right? So what happened was the power strips were back ordered. And so the manufacturer was drop shipping them as they became available. So out of that $20,000, it wound up being 36 shipments with different invoices. And because it took so long to deliver, the pricing actually changed in the client's favor. So like there was a few invoices that were 13 cents, $1.35 less than what it should have been. And you would think the government would be like, oh, cool, thumbs up. Instead, the government's mind just blows up because they're like, this invoice doesn't match what we thought it was supposed to be.
Yep.
So they didn't want to reconcile the invoice and pay. And then you've got your internal staff doing 36 invoices for a $20,000 order, and because they didn't understand the process and stuff like that. So understanding how your manufacturers work, having a good relationship with them, it's key to making the middleman strategy work. When you don't have that and you're optimistic that, oh, I'll just go and do this, it's not going to work well. And you're probably not going to get the best pricing. So, if I have been working with a manufacturer for 10 years and you just show up Monday, who's getting the better price?
Right.
It's not you.
And then also who sells the more volume, because, it's like you got these relationships that are already established, plus they're your volume seller. So you're certainly not going to give the person that calls you up with no relationship the same volume price discount. So you're already going to be outcompeted right there on price.
Yeah. So you waste a lot of time chasing stuff you shouldn't be because, again, hey, the middleman strategy, it's so easy making money in your underwear from home, right? It's so easy. And that's
if it was so easy, Michael would be doing it.
Well, I mean, you're in the underwear anyway. But it's the cautionary tale of, I'm not saying it doesn't work, but if you know all these things we're talking about, you can make sure to put the right, mechanisms in place so that you don't have those problems. Because that's the biggest thing for me is I see people get in or they've quit their job or they're out of a job, and instead of looking for a job, they're trying to sell stuff to the government. The other thing about this is not understanding the customer very well. We had a client last year that they put out about a dozen quotes for a customer that came to them in a 30-day period and asked them to quote. And so they quoted roughly $2.5 million worth of product on these 12 orders. And I'm following up. And I'm like, man, what? Tell me what's going on with those. And 90 days go by, 120 days go by, almost 6 months go by. And the client says, we just got a note. They canceled everything. They're out of funding. So they canceled every one of those bids, all $2.5 million. Because again, they did not understand the customer and their process and how things work. So, I mean, they were spending their money, hey, we're going to win this. We think we got the best price. And then the government just cancels every single one because it was one client that had put all those out. So, so there's a lot of those little pitfalls that you don't think about when you're trying to do this. I'd say the last one to me is when you're being the middleman, you have almost zero control, right? So like if the manufacturer makes any sort of change or there's a volume issue or whatever, you have no control over that type of stuff to deliver to your customer. And that can affect you in a lot of different ways. When you are the manufacturer or when you're the service provider, you have control over what you're delivering and how you're delivering it, the quality standards, all these little things that are really, really important in a customer relationship. And so I really value those direct relationships versus the manufacturer. And I'll tell you, I said that was the last one. I have one more. I was the manufacturer at one point where we were a really small business. We were doing about $10 million a year. And at some point, when I got put into a senior position at this company, this was like 20 years ago, one of the first things I said was, we're going to cancel all VAR agreements because the previous owners of the company had set up, I call them drug deals, the way they had done it, these really bad drug deals where we were the manufacturer and we were getting maybe a 20% profit on our own product because the government had convinced these guys, you got to go through us. We're the big prime. The big names, you would know them if I said the big names, like you got to go through us to sell to the government because we hold the contracts. And one of the first decisions I made was we're going to cancel all of our agreements. And we're going to sell direct to the government. And it was a decision I made that no one outside the company had control over it. So any of those people that wanted to sell our product couldn't anymore. And again, it was one of those things where we shouldn't be the manufacturer making 20%. We should be making the bulk of the money there. So yeah, the control is a really big one. So I can talk about these all day. People know from the podcast, I'm not a huge fan of this strategy. I think there's too many dollar signs for people. But like I've said a couple of times, you can do it right if you are aware of the challenges and you build the right relationships and you understand, like everything else, it's going to take time. It's going to take time. To your point, you did it for a year and did 300,000 in revenue. That's pretty average, I would say, for a company just getting into this. So understanding it's not an overnight strategy. It takes a lot of time to build those relationships, put the pieces together. If you go into it with that, you'll be a lot more successful than most people. Because again, you're just aware of the facts. So I'll get off my soapbox. So
no, thank you, Michael, and we'll turn back to Nicole here. But I did want to say too, so there are case studies that of companies that have done this successful. I'll just name a couple right here off the top of my head. Atlantic Dive Supply. If you ever want to look at those folks, they started out as a dive supply company. Now they sell like almost everything, but they've got their processes down. They understand the compliance elements. They understand, making sure their, manufacturers understand how they have to package it, how they have to invoice the government. By the way, always only invoice the government per order that you ship, because that's the way that they pay you. They go and look to see, hey, have we got the product? Yep. Here's the invoice. Here's what we ordered. Those three match and we can pay. But like Michael alluded to, is like if you start getting shipments with different invoices that, the person can't say, oh, yep, it's here. That's going to cause you some issues. Another company that was actually in my neck of the woods was a company called Howco, HOWCO. They actually did a lot of like military sales, but again, they've got, schedules, they've got their processes, they've got like whole teams of people that's all that they do all day is basically look at requirements from the government, reach out to their manufacturers. They actually have their own processing facility, which as one of the V's that they add with the value, it's like sometimes a lot of their manufacturers will ship their products to the Halco facility so that they can actually package it up into the standards that the military wants it in, then on ship it to them. So those are all things to consider. And again, Nicole, we'll turn it back to you, but and I know you guys have probably seen a lot and had, a lot of stories both on the successes and on the failures of this as well. So what is your kind of final thoughts as we look at this, and then we'll kind of cut it and we'll take the Q&As, but
yeah,
what is your kind of Jerry Springer final thoughts here?
I love it. Yeah, Michael definitely brought up a couple of things that great point. And I've got a little to add. One of the big things I would say when you are newer to being kind of the middleman to things, I highly advise not necessarily just trusting your larger business subs, your larger business manufacturing companies. I cannot tell you how many clients have come to me and said, thanks for the 8A program help. We're in, we're so happy. So now this large company wants us to get these contracts and give them all the work. So if you can just help us do that. And okay, well, no matter what they're telling you here, that's not going to work. You would also be the one on the hook as the prime, not them. So one of the biggest, I think, takeaways, pieces of advice, and Michael definitely touched on this too, is find somebody that has no ulterior motive to really fill you in on the details, to look at your specific situation. I talked a little about the different kinds of limitations on subcontracting and the different kinds of how you could have a manufacturer rule here apply. You could have a non-manufacturer rule here apply. You really need someone to take a look at your contract, what NAICS code it uses, And when you get into things like mixed contracts, it gets more complicated. You divide up the contract into supplies and services, and whichever is more is typically the rule you have to follow. All of it gets very complicated. And you may be thinking, well, I've got this wonderful large business sub I've worked with for a while. They're super nice. They're telling me that this is all going to be okay. They're not the ones that are going to be in massive amounts of trouble if it turns out you just make yourself a pass through. So if you are newer, if you don't know the rules, absolutely educate yourself. And that if you're just insistent that not be through an attorney, not my best plan, but if you're insistent, at least get out there and do some research, do the blogs, do grab a handbook or two if you can find one. Shameless plug, we've got our size and affiliation handbook coming out really soon. So keep an eye on our blog if you want to know when that's released, but that talks about a lot of things regarding, how you need to be careful, what you're doing to make sure you stay in your size. It mentions limitations on subcontracting, non-manufacturer, all those things. But yeah, just really making sure you are educated. Don't take somebody's word for it that has a dog in the race, because they don't have a whole lot of motivation to tell you that you have to make sure you perform a certain amount. They want as much work as possible. They love getting the 8A, WOSB, small business work that they couldn't otherwise get. And I'm not saying they're even necessarily have bad intentions there, as much as they don't have the same motivations to make sure those rules are being followed that you do. So it is very important that you educate yourself and make sure you know what's going to apply to your contract. And that's, I think, the biggest takeaway, kind of no matter what aspect of the conversation we're talking about. So
Awesome. Well, three things I've got here. And one, education. We've got some great education on the Govology platform. I know Michael and Josh have also some great things at Federal Access if you guys want some education, and they've also got some great books. Get the education. Number two, I would say, is get yourself with an expert. I always advocate I know Michael don't like the word mastermind, but I always advocate for folks having a mastermind network of experts that they can talk with, and attorneys like Nicole that specialize in GovCon can really help you understand what you really need to do to be compliant. So, middleman strategy, is it doable? Yes. Is it easy? No, not necessarily, but it's possible. But you do need the education, and you do need, I think, the expert guidance to make sure that you're doing it in the right way. Or, best case scenario is they just reject your order. Worst case scenario is they have you go ahead and ship it and then tell you, hey, this is not labeled in the right way, and there's plenty of horror stories on that. And that's really all I've got. Michael, do you have any last words on that as well?
Yeah, I think you both summed it up really, really well. I think the education being big. I do think I really value having a team of experts around you. I think that is really, really important. And then I think the hardest part for most people when they're doing this is internally having a bid, no bid process. It's don't look at everything with dollar signs, especially when you're starting off. Focus on a niche, focus on something and understand it's going to take some time. And again, like you said, if you follow some of these guidelines, the odds are you're going to be way more successful than the people who just jump in. They're all over the map. They don't understand the products. They don't understand the services, and they're just, trying to make dollars out of it. So really take your time with that.
Awesome. Well, we're going to wrap up on this episode of GovCon Coffee and Issues, but if you are online with us, hang out. We're going to be doing a Q&A. If you're watching us live on Facebook, video, YouTube, and you want to join the Q&A, if you go over to govology.com/issues, you can join us over there. But with that, what we'll do is we'll say goodbye to you for now, for those of you who may be watching this on demand, and encourage you to join us on Govology Nation if you have continuing questions about this. You can get there by going to wow, I just forgot my own website. Govology.com/issues. www.govology.com/issues. I think I'm having issues with memory.
You're having issues.
That's a different episode. With that, thanks everyone. And now we're going to do some Q&A.